river coiled like a silver serpent under the moon, its skin flashing with broken shards of light as if the current itself were carrying secrets downstream. The forest floor breathed like a restless giant beneath the soil, each root shifting with the weight of something unseen, and I felt it through my boots as if the earth itself were unsettled. Time hung in the air like frost that refused to melt, lingering on the skin, slowing every breath into something measured and deliberate. I had been walking that trail alone, 50 years of memory crowding behind my eyes, and still the silence felt heavier than war had ever been. I never thought I would tell anyone about that October. Even now, saying it aloud, shaping the words, it feels like I am betraying some pact I never agreed to but somehow still signed. My name doesn't matter. The uniform I once wore doesn't matter. What matters is what waited for me in those woods, what looked me in the eyes across a cold river, and what has never left me since. The trip had started like so many others. After my wife passed 3 years earlier, I had made a ritual of the wilderness. I told myself I was camping, fishing, clearing my head, but the truth was simpler. The woods were the only place where silence didn't feel cruel. I could sit by a fire and listen to the night instead of the empty rooms of my house. I could let grief breathe in the open air without it strangling me. By October, the nights were long, the holidays coming fast, days that magnified absence like a lens. My kids had their own lives on the other side of the country. California sun, suburban houses, families I saw twice a year if fortune was kind. In Michigan, the leaves were dying in slow fire, and I thought one last trip north before the snow would do me good. I loaded the truck with my old aluminum canoe, my pack, my rifle. Always the rifle. A habit carried from jungles half a world away. I told myself it was for bears, maybe wolves, though I knew deep down it was also for ghosts. Those shapes that don't belong in the corner of the eye but linger anyway. The weather was perfect those first days. Clear skies, air cool enough to sting the lungs, mornings rimmed with frost that burned away by noon. I set camp 15 miles from the nearest road, tucked in a clearing beside a stand of birch that shivered like pale sentinels whenever the wind ran through them. The river lay half a mile off, a voice hidden by trees, close enough to drink from, fish from, yet far enough that the night sounds of rushing water wouldn't drown the small noises I relied on to sleep safe. For 3 days, nothing. Coffee on a fire that snapped too loud in the cold, trout on a pan, the pages of an old paperback curling at the corners, stars opening themselves above the clearing like a map. I could almost remember how to read. My hands remembered how to tie knots, sharpen hooks, strike flint. My body remembered how to carry silence. For a while, it felt like peace. The kind of peace men like me don't trust because it rarely stays. On the 4th afternoon, I went for water. The sun was sinking into that dull copper color it finds in October, shadows long but still warm with light. I knew the path by heart. A narrow game trail running downhill, needles soft beneath the boots, the river's voice growing clearer with each step. I walked with the lazy rhythm of a man whose muscles had finally begun to unclench. I carried my canteen loose in one hand, my rifle slung across my back. I wasn't expecting anything but water. And then the world folded in. The noise stopped, the kind of stop that isn't natural. It wasn't just quiet, it was absence. The chickadees that had been stitching, their calls between branches, unraveled into nothing. The insects cut their thin wires of sound. Even the river hushed, its voice suddenly behind glass. The forest stood still the way a courtroom does when the verdict is about to be read. That was when I saw the shape. At first, my mind scrambled for the ordinary. A bear, maybe, tall against the water, broad across the shoulders. But the longer I looked, the further away that explanation slid. This thing wasn't rising up to bluff or threaten like a bear does. It was simply there, upright, balanced, as though standing on 2 legs was the only way it had ever learned to be. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, fur dark as wet earth, arms too long for any human frame, hands hanging low, heavy with intent. Its shoulders carried width like a yoke, the kind of power that belongs to mountains and storms. It hadn't seen me at first. It was still as the river, its head tilted down, watching the water as though waiting for it to confess something. Then it lifted its face. Our eyes met across that clearing, and I felt the bottom drop out of my chest. Combat teaches you the weight of being hunted. There's a particular cold that slides into the bones when an unseen rifle has you in its sights. This was the same weight, magnified. It was looking at me, not like an animal deciding fight or flight, but like something calculating. We held each other's gaze for no more than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, I felt myself dismantled. Not prey, not rival, not exactly human, just a trespasser in someone else's country. And then it moved. God help me, I had never seen anything that big move like that. One moment still as a boulder, the next a blur exploding into the tree line, crashing through undergrowth with impossible speed. Branches snapped like kindling. Leaves swirled in its wake. Then nothing. Not even the echo of retreat. My legs wanted to buckle. I forced myself down to the river, dipped the canteen with hands shaking like they had in Vietnam after the first firefight. The water spilled and stung against my fingers, but I couldn't steady them. I kept turning, every angle of the tree suddenly suspicious, waiting for those eyes to reappear. Somehow I walked back to camp. Somehow, I made a fire and swallowed burnt coffee like it could burn away what I had seen. I told myself it was a bear, light playing tricks, anything but what I knew. Because knowing meant a world I wasn't ready to live in. That night, the forest pressed against me. Every sound struck like a warning. Wind in the birch leaves stretched into footsteps. The owl's call warped into signals passed from one unseen throat to another. I dozed and woke, each hour slower than the last. Sometime after 3, I woke to silence again, the heavy, deliberate kind. If you've ever slept in woods, you know there is never complete silence. There is always the hum of life working beneath the dark. Crickets rubbing, mice rustling, even the low shift of soil beneath roots. But now the silence was a skin over everything, pulled tight, suffocating. The hair on my arms prickled. My hand found the rifle before my eyes even opened all the way. I didn't move, not at first. Just lay there, breath shallow, listening to the pressure of being observed. It was the same dread I had felt in enemy territory. Lying in tall grass, knowing somewhere in the brush, a rifle might already be aligned. I told myself to breathe evenly, to keep still, to wait. Minutes passed like hours. Then just as slowly, the forest exhaled. A cricket started. A branch shifted. The spell broke. But the knowing didn't leave. By morning, I told myself to leave. Any sane man would have packed up, paddled back downstream, and driven until there was pavement beneath every wheel. But curiosity has teeth. The image of what I saw clung to me like burrs, sharper in the light than in the night. I had to know. Had to prove to myself whether it was madness or real. So I went back. I took the rifle this time, cradled across my arms, and moved low through brush until I found a nest of shrubs, downstream from the shoal. I crouched there, hidden, heart-hammering, and I waited. Hours turned into more hours. I was beginning to think I'd dreamed it all, that my grief and loneliness had conjured a hallucination. And then I heard them. Footsteps. Not one set, 2, heavy, deliberate, the cadence of something that does not rush because it does not need to. They emerged into the river bend, not one but 2 figures, towering in the light, both upright, both impossibly large. The first was the same dark brown I had seen before. The second bore a lighter coat, tinged with red where the sunlight caught it. They moved with an authority I can't explain, as if the river itself had been waiting for them. They fished with hands alone, striking with speed no man could match. They pulled trout from the water as though the fish had never had a chance. Movements efficient and quiet. They communicated too. Not random sounds, not animal cries. A language, low grunts, clicks, gestures, head tilts, rhythms that carried purpose. They conversed. At one point, the lighter one plucked something from the current. A piece of twisted metal, perhaps from a fisherman's lost gear. It turned it in its hand, showed it to the darker one. They studied it like it was evidence of intrusion. Then with a forceful throw, it was gone downstream. I understood the message. They knew we were here and they did not want reminders of us. I watched them clean their space. Bones and scales gathered, the mud smoothed where they had stood. They left nothing but water behind, no trace, no evidence, as though erasure was second nature. Then the darker one turned. Its head angled toward the brush where I crouched, my breath loud inside my skull. It made a sound, not aggressive, not alarm, but a warning. They knew I was there. They had always known. They left together. Into the trees, their steps as certain as gravity. I stayed crouched long after, my legs numb, my chest aching from shallow breaths. When I finally rose, I went to the riverbank, to the mud where they had stood. And there I saw it, the footprint. 18, maybe 20 inches long, wider than my chest. Toes splayed, each tipped with something that had scraped the mud sharp. My own boot beside it looked like a child's toy. The smell lingered, musky, wild. Not rot, not animal. Something heavier, older. I lifted the camera from my pack, snapped pictures though my hands shook too much to keep the frame steady. Proof, I thought. At last, proof. But proof is never enough. Not when the forest begins to close its hand around you. When the silence descends again like a verdict. When branches break 50 yards behind you in rhythm with your own stride. I walked fast, then ran. The sound followed. Not running, just stepping. As if whatever shadow trailed me knew it didn't need to hurry. I reached camp breathless, rifle ready, fire piled high. Nothing came, but I felt them circling. That night the calls began. Low, haunting, one voice answered by another, then another, echoing through the trees. They were spaced wide, a mile perhaps, but the pattern wrapped around me like a net. They were talking to each other, talking around me. The fire threw sparks that died too quickly, the darkness pressing closer. I sat with the rifle across my knees, listening to the voices of a family or a tribe spread through the night. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Dawn brought light but not peace. And I understood something then. I was not a visitor. I was a trespasser. And the woods had decided to remind me. Morning didn't arrive so much as seep in, a thin wash of pale that bled through the trees and took its time remembering how to be day. The fire had collapsed into a red breath, and the tin mug, forgotten on a flat rock, wore a rim of ash like a tired crown. My hands shook when I laced my boots, not with panic but with the aftermath of a night spent listening for footsteps that sometimes were mine and sometimes weren't. I told myself to break camp. I even rolled the tarp and cinched it tight. The pack stood there like a loyal dog waiting to be told where to heel. But the woods weren't done with me. And if I'm honest, I wasn't done with them either. I walked without committing to a direction, taking the long way around my own fear. The smell of spruce had sharpened in the cold, and every spiderweb jeweled, with dew looked like a warning strung between decisions. 100 yards from the clearing I found their trail, not a game path, not the low weaving of deer, but a corridor with intention. Saplings leaned outward as if a slow wind had taught them new manners. Bark scuffed at a height that made my shoulders feel small. The ground held prints the way a bed holds, warmth after someone rises, not obvious unless you touch the sheet with your hand and feel what the eye can't see. I didn't walk on the line itself. I kept to the shadow beside it, towing pine duff, counting breath to keep the mind from running. Every 20 paces or so there was a sign that had nothing to do with chance. A broken branch set neatly, aside instead of left underfoot. A patch of needles thickened as if to make a softer step for something younger. A low limb twisted, not snapped, like a finger bending to point. Half a mile in, the temperature seemed to drop in a way the weather couldn't explain. It wasn't cold so much as precise, a coolness with edges. I stopped where the light grew green and granular and said, quietly, I'll turn back. I don't know why I spoke out loud. The moment I did, a breeze found the trees and moved through them from nowhere, lifting the damp off my face. And the small noises came back in shy, staggered returns, a fly's thin violin, a chipmunk's scold, a pine cone ticking when it hit rock. Back at camp, the pack still waited. I loosened the straps. A man can be brave and foolish in the same hour. I made coffee I didn't drink and hiked the ridge instead, thinking elevation might pry the day open differently. From the crown of the hill, the river wore its color honestly, slate and glass, and the shoal where I'd first seen them, glittered with little knives of light. I lay prone behind the blowdown and let the world shrink to the circle my binoculars could hold. They came late, as if the morning's business had run long. Two at first, the familiar dark bulk and the red-brown shadow a head shorter, and then a third shape slipped from cedar to rock and stood to watch the water with its head cocked so far to one side. I felt my own neck tilt in sympathy, smaller by a handspan, narrow through the chest, steps careful the way a child's can be when the stakes feel high. The older two worked without waste. The smaller mimicked, tarrying in shallow eddies, hands hovering a second too late, splashes a fraction too loud. When the older one stilled its palm and then swept it into the current, the smaller did the same a beat after, missing and trying not to show it. The red-brown one reached out once and pressed its hand to the small one's shoulder, not reprimand, correction. They spoke while they worked. The sounds were low and built to travel, throat notes padded with breath, a soft clicking behind the teeth, a whistle shaped through closed lips that reminded me of the way A boatswain's pipe can cut across a deck without raising its voice. Fingers talk too, flat palms, a half turn of the wrist. A two-finger tap to the forearm as if to say, here, not there. None of it was performance. If anything, I felt like the performance was mine. A man pretending invisibility while the world wrote his outline on every leaf. At the near bank, just upstream, a pattern caught the corner of my eye. Not scratches, not random scars of weather, marks. 4 vertical lines with a cross stroke, then a small triangle beneath, and beside it a long, shallow gouge smoothed by hand. Some private notation, a ledger kept in bark. I didn't take a picture. The camera felt loud just thinking about it. They finished with the river, gathered what they'd taken, and wiped the scene the way they always did. Palms turning mud to a blank page. When the small one bent to imitate the gesture, it left ridges uneven and proud, and the taller smoothed them only halfway, leaving the last of the younger's lines intact. That mercy startled me more than anything else I'd seen. I eased off the ridge on elbows and belly, but I hadn't made 10 yards before I felt the look. The way you feel sunlight even with your eyes closed. Down at the water, the dark figure's head had lifted. I was not part of the landscape. Neither was I being treated like a mistake. A single sound traveled up to me, almost too low to hear, not a threat, not suggestion. A pin driven into the map that said we are aware. That afternoon I found something like a shelter, where the trail bent and the spruce grew crowded. It wasn't a den. It wasn't furniture, but the needles under a leaning jack pine were laid, deeper than the surrounding forest. A cradle of green that still wore the shape of weight. Beside it a scatter of fish bones caged by willow sticks, not thrown, placed. Above it, 2 strands of coarse hair clung to bark at a height. That made me say a word I'd given up years ago. I wanted to believe in ordinary things. Ordinary was running out of road. I told myself again to leave. I put everything I owned into the pack and stood with the straps in hand and felt the hours move like a slow river around my ankles. And then the day broke itself on dusk. The first branch crack came from the right, fresh wood giving way with a clean note, and every nerve I had turned to listen. My flashlight made a weak tunnel in the dark. Eyeshine stood inside the tunnel, 2 green coins set where no deer would place them. When I swung the beam, another pair ignited in the brush opposite, level with my shoulder and steady. A third blinked from the path ahead. They weren't closing in. They were setting a frame. I put my back to the oak with the lightning scar and spoke. The way you speak to a dog that doesn't belong to you, palm out and open, voice low so the words don't have to carry to work. I said I wanted to go back to my camp. I said I was leaving. The face that entered the circle of light wasn't the dark one from the river. It was the red-brown, the beveled jaw and heavy brow taking the light like stone takes rain. Up close, the proportions rearranged my expectations. The eyes too deep, the mouth too broad, a forehead that sloped in a way that made the skull look more built than grown. And still, behind the angles, there was the thing that mattered. Attention, unblinking, precise. It raised a hand, not a threat, a signpost. The gesture couldn't have been clearer. If it had worn an orange vest, back the way you came. I went. The movement behind me wasn't pursuit. It was escort. When I hurried, they didn't. When I stopped, a second set of eyes lit the brush to the side as if to remind me of the route. Once brambles hooked the strap of my pack and held me. And in the clumsy seconds it took to free myself, the red-brown shape rocked on its heels. A human gesture if you stripped it of culture and left only bone and habit. Camp took shape out of the dark the way shoreline shows itself from fog. First as doubt and then as fact. I put wood on the coals until the flame climbed into a steady shape and set the rifle. Across my knees, not to use but to steady. The hands that remembered other nights, other darks,